Hi everybody, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and this week we'll take a look at we'll answer some viewer questions. The last couple of weeks we looked at some viewer games, but this time we'll answer some questions. And there are fewer questions than there were games to look at, but I think these are very interesting questions, and there'll be plenty of good content in this show. Okay, well the first one comes from Modern Elite, who asks, he says the following, writes the following. I have a question about having the initiative. This is one of the most confusing comments I see in chess books. And X has the initiative, or X is or has to fight for the initiative, or with initiative for black, and so on. I know what the concept of the initiative, is, the person controlling the course of the game by forcing his opponent to respond to their threats and plans. But my question is, why does that really matter? What if they're just forcing the opponent into a better position? Why does the initiative mean anything if it is eventually diffused? How does one fight for the initiative? If you could just elaborate on this mystical comment or demonstrate it somehow, I'd really appreciate it. It confuses me to no end. Well, it seems to me that if you understand what the initiative is, then to some extent you should understand why it matters. But perhaps this might be the best way of clarifying the concept, or maybe answering your confusion. And it's that we should distinguish between an advantage and the advantage. What I mean by that is this, that there are many different kinds of advantages one can have in a game. You can have a better pawn structure. Does it mean you're winning? Well, no, you might be a rook down and getting mated next move. But still, having a better pawn structure is an advantage. Having extra material is an advantage. It's not infallible. It doesn't mean you have the advantage because, again, you could be getting mated. So there are a variety of ways in which one could have an advantage. More space, more material, better development, better structure, on and on and on. And having the initiative. But it doesn't mean that you have the advantage, because all things considered, when all the relevant factors are taken into account, the particular advantages you have might not be as great as those that your opponent has. So the initiative, I would say, is one type of advantage among many. Generally speaking, all things being equal, forcing your opponent to respond to what you're doing on the board gives you an advantage. Okay, if you get to dictate the play, then, well, that's advantageous in a number of ways. So first of all, you're getting to decide what's happening. Your opponent has to react. And so that means that you're both controlling what's going on to some extent. It may be short term. It may not be an initiative that lasts forever. But to the extent that you get to determine what's going on and where, that's to your advantage. Also, it's a psychological advantage. I mean, one thing we should maybe remember is that in an objective sense, in a very strictly objective sense, there's no such thing as an advantage other than having a winning position. So if it's, God versus God, the position is either a win for one side or it's a draw, and that's it. There's no such thing as a slight advantage or a clear advantage even. It's just win or a draw, period. So whenever we're talking about having the advantage, if we don't mean that one side is winning by force, we're always referring to something psychological or probabilistic. So in such and such a position, if white's slightly better, we may mean something like white will be expected to score, let's say, 60 to 65% of the time. We'll outscore his opponent, let's say 60 to 40 or 65 to 35 in 100 games theoretically from that position. That would be the kind of thing that we would mean, but it doesn't mean that there's anything objective. There's nothing sort of tangible that you can cash that out into. So it's a probabilistic remark. King and pawn versus king. Okay, if it's me versus a beginner and I've got the pawn, I'm probably going to win. I don't assume that a beginner is going to find the opposition every time and defend it. If it's the beginner versus me, the beginner has no advantage at all. Or if it's a grandmaster versus me, there's no advantage. Okay, anyone, once they've learned the concept of the opposition, if it's a position where their king is in front of the pawn and they can achieve the opposition, it's just a dead draw. It's an equal position. So to say that one player has the advantage, again, unless it's just a forced win, is to make a person-relative statement. And in fact, really, I mean, a position can be objectively winning, but might be so difficult to win for a given player, even for a given human player, even a world champion, that it kind of goes the other way around. So a position might be subjectively, practically speaking, winning, but not objectively speaking, and the reverse can be true too. So going back to the initiative, I think there are various reasons why it's an advantage. It's psychologically easier. You're creating pressure. It's easier to attack than to defend for almost everybody, maybe for everybody. And again, the fact that you get to determine where the play is just gives you all kinds of practical advantages. So here's a nice example. Of course, you already wrote that you understand the concept, but for those who would like to see it in action, this might be helpful. So this is from a game between Tukhmakov and Garry Kasparov, played back in 1981. Kasparov had black, and this was played in the last round. And he needed to win this game to tie Sakis, assuming Lev Sakis drew his game, which in fact he did. By winning this game, Kasparov would tie for first and win or co-win his first Soviet championship. So here's what happened. Bishop to f5. So here we see Kasparov creates his first threat against this knight on e5. So he's got two guys attacking it, the bishop and the rook. Okay, well, Tukhmakov responds, plays knight to c6. So he saves the knight, hits the queen. Now Kasparov could play queen to b6, defending the c-pawn, but chooses instead to keep the initiative up with queen d7. So attacks the knight, and then after rook takes c5, rook e1, queen e1, rook e8. So every move is threatening something, and he's bringing all his pieces into play into more and more active spots. Okay, Tukhmakov plays queen c1, shoring up the defense on the c-file. Now knight to b6. Okay, so now knight takes a4 is threatened, and also it discovers an attack on the d-file against the bishop. Well, of course, the bishop is adequately protected, but we can see, I mean, white's construction is very, very flexible, or very fragile, I mean to say. There's threats here. There's maybe a threat if bishop takes b2, and then knight takes a4. The back rank is a bit weak, so you can see these squares e1 and d1 could get visited at some point. And white also has to keep an eye on this knight on c6. So you can see, oh, and I should maybe add too, that if this knight on c6 were to move, then the b5 knight might come under attack, especially again after knight takes a4. So you can see all these white pieces getting very vulnerable here. So Tukhmakov plays b3, which protects the a4 pawn, which protects the b5 knight, and so on. Okay, well, now Kasparov makes another threat. So it's like 5 moves in a row with threats here. Of course, he's threatening the bishop, and again, the rook is getting more active. Now, all this time, he doesn't have the advantage yet. So with best play, Tukhmakov is still fine here. All right, so it's not the case that Kasparov has the advantage. He's down 2 pawns, but he's creating more and more threats. His pieces are very, very active, and Tukhmakov has to be extremely careful here. So he plays bishop to a5. So he removes the bishop from attack, counterattacks against the knight. Looks very good. Well, now Kasparov finds the move bishop to e4, and now there's a new attack. So if white were to play bishop takes b6, for instance, then queen g4, threatening mate. G3 would allow queen f3. F3 would allow queen takes g2 mate. And after queen f1, rook e1 is a killer. So Tukhmakov played knight to e5 here. Alright, so again, he's trying to counter-threaten, and it also covers the g4 square. But no problem. Queen e7, and now there's new threats. So once again, he's attacking the knight twice, with the bishop and with the queen. He's also threatening, in some cases, to take here. Of course, not yet, because if queen takes, there's no rook e1 because this bishop on a5 is covering it. But it's getting loose. And also, there could be some lines where the queen finds her way to g5 as well. So, oops, didn't mean to delete the colors there. Okay, so here, I believe Tukhmakov had to play queen f1. But instead he played knight to d4, which looks quite logical. So he's kicking the rook and overprotecting the c2 square. But more things happen. Bad things happen. So rook a2. And, okay, so it saves the rook, keeps the rook active on the 7th rank, or black 7th rank, the 2nd rank of the board. And, you know, there might be some rook a1 tricks to be aware about too. And, of course, the threat is still on with the knight on e5. Also, again, now there's the threat of queen takes c5, and then rook a1. So there's that idea in action. Okay, Well, here, white played bishop takes b6. So he grabs the piece, and now that the rook is sufficiently protected, there's no queen c5, rook a1 stuff. All right. Kasparov takes, and now, once again, there's a threat to play bishop takes d4. Well, still, perhaps Tukhmakov is okay, but move after move, having to calculate all these variations and having to respond to one threat after another, he finally cracks here. So the best move would have been queen to e1, and after queen f6, it's still very, very complicated, and probably the position is starting to favor black, but it's still tenable for white. But he played queen to e3, and finally he had lost the thread here, so he missed it. Queen takes c5, and Tukhmakov resigns because simply bishop c5, rook a1 is forcing mate, and there's no other good move for white. So a very powerful display by Kasparov of what to do with the initiative and making it grow. And anyway, I hope this was illustrative for those who aren't really that familiar with the concept, and I hope my answer was helpful on a conceptual level for modern elite. Okay, next question comes from, this is a question I actually addressed in the queen ending, or in last week's show, I believe, the Viewer Games show. So he asks this. So in the context of the last week's show, he was asking about a particular queen ending. Here it's just a question, and I'll quickly repeat my answer. So he asks about queen endings. He has seen from, or I'll just read for what he says. I've seen from table bases that some of these endings can be extremely long and complex. My question is, what are some guidelines to follow that could help to play these endings, or to understand the logic behind the best moves? Also, why are these endings discussed much less often than rook endings when they are fairly common? Well, okay, there's a few questions there. I'll repeat first the guidelines that I think are quite helpful. So one, very important to centralize the queen. So the queen is definitely a piece that benefits from centralizing. And that's not true of all the pieces. So rooks, for instance, if it's an open board, a rook is going to cover 14 squares, no matter where it is. So you can stick it in the corner, it covers 14 squares. You can stick it in the middle of the board, it covers 14 squares. So rooks are a bit counterintuitive in that sense, but queens very much benefit from being centralized. Okay, secondly, the quality of the pawns rather than, let me start that again. The quality of the pawns, especially passed pawns, count for more than quantity. Okay, so it's not necessarily the case that you should be overly concerned whether you're the stronger side or the weaker side in the queen ending with the pawn count. It's not to say that they don't matter, but that if you have the chance to create a strong passed pawn, or for that matter to eliminate one from your opponent, then take that very seriously, even if it comes at the cost of a pawn, or even, two pawns. An example that I should have looked up but didn't beforehand, it just occurred to me now. There's a Rubinstein Capablanca game where I believe Capablanca sacrificed 2 pawns to achieve a drawn queen ending. I'm not sure where it's from. I have a vague recollection that it might be from Bad Kissingen in 1928. I might be wrong about that, but anyway, it won't be too difficult to find the game. They didn't play that many games, and as I said, it's a queen ending, and maybe the only one between the two of them. And Capablanca sacrificed a pawn or 2, but was able to hold the draw. Okay, so that was the second point. The second, let's say, generalization, second guideline. The third is not to confuse lots and lots of checks with a perpetual check. So it's sometimes the case that the strong side's king will have to go out for a little journey into the middle of the board in order to make a passed pawn promote, or just because if you want to make a passed pawn promote, sometimes the queen has to help the pawn, and in doing so, it leaves the king vulnerable to checks. So sometimes the king just does have to go out and running around. Now, sometimes a perpetual check will result. I mean, it is a possibility. But the fact that there are a lot of checks is not a perpetual. And when you're the side with the king trying to avoid the draw and your king is running around, you have 3 possible resources. So one is your own pawns, of course, trying to hide behind them. But a second is to use your opponent's pawns. So very often you can use your opponent's pawns as a shield. And a third thing that you should keep an eye out for are cross checks. In other words, situations where you can block your opponent's check with your queen and in the process give check yourself. So that's a very, very powerful tool. And one way to set that up, for instance, is to put your king on the same rank as the opponent's king. And often, at some point, you'll force your opponent to give check, if your opponent wants to give check, on that same file. And when you block, or sorry, on the same rank, and when you block it, you're either giving, well, you won't be giving check there, but you'll be pinning the opponent's queen to the king and forcing a trade of queens. So the cross checks would, of course, be diagonal. Anyway, those are three very standard but very important guidelines. Now, as to why they're discussed much less often than rook endings when they're fairly common, well, I kind of disagree with that. I don't think they're especially common at all, at least compared to rook endings. I mean, I think in my own tournament history, I doubt I've had even as many as 5 or 10. Maybe I've had 5, but I don't think I've even had 10 queen endings. And on the other hand, I've had dozens of rook endings. I mean, I think the proportions are completely out of balance there. So I think, yeah, I mean, just frankly speaking, I mean, queen endings, it is good to know some things about them, but they're exceptionally, they're not, let's say, they're not 1 in 1,000 sorts of things. I mean, you'll maybe get 1 in 50, 1 in 100 games. You might see a queen ending, but most people don't get them very often, and generally when they arise, they well, okay, I won't belabor the point. Just to suffice to say that there is value to knowing a little bit about them. The sorts of principles that I elaborated, I think, will be helpful. But if you have to choose between setting rook endings and queen endings, definitely spend your time on rook endings. Okay, on to the next question. So this comes from JWiz, and he asks, could you explain the ideas behind the Lopez knight move? And what he means is, oh wait, I'm sorry. I'll come back to that in a moment. I skipped one here accidentally, or maybe it was, maybe not accidentally, maybe subliminally. I wanted to skip over it. So this is from Big Potzer, who's an A player, and says he really enjoyed my videos on the knight or Sicilian, but he's a Sveshnikov player with black, and so it would be very, very good if I could do some stuff about the Sveshnikov. Well, I'm kind of inclined not to, and the reason is not because there's anything wrong with the Sveshnikov, but okay, I didn't really intend in the first place to have that humongous series on the Najdorf, so that's really the exception. I mean, I don't especially want to make these big opening videos or series. Also because I think it's it's not that I don't want to say anything about openings at all. I definitely do, especially when I'm covering presenting a full game. But I don't think the most useful kind of video is an opening video. So sometimes you can get some good concepts, but especially with an opening like the Sveshnikov, which is so tactical and so deeply worked out, it seems to me not really especially useful to do that. So, if there's like some specific sub variation where there's some interesting point that we can discuss, okay, that might be interesting, but just to discuss an opening that has 200-300 page books come out on it every other year, I think isn't so worthwhile. But as a little concession, I'll bring up kind of an interesting little sideline that you might not know about. Okay, so this is all very, very standard, and here the right move, I would say, is knight to a3. Certainly by far and away the most common move. And then after b5, white has a choice between bishop takes f6, and black takes with the g-pawn, or knight to d5, and bishop to e7, bishop f6, bishop f6. Okay, the last sequence wasn't forced, but it's overwhelmingly the most common. And okay, so these are the two main options, but you might wonder, well, why not bishop takes f6 straight away? I mean, does this hurt anything? I mean, won't we just transpose after gf6, knight a3, b5, and so on? Well, the answer is that black has two options here. And it's worth knowing about this in case you're playing someone who's a little bit careless with white and thinks that this is just the same thing. So the two options are d5 and f5. Now, d5 is quite sharp and interesting, but in fact it seems to be better for white. So knight e5, takes, say bishop e6, bishop a4, bishop c4. And okay, white's queenside pawn structure is obviously not especially elegant, but given the exchanges that have occurred, black really isn't going to have very good chances at all for typical Sveshnikov counterplay. And it looks like this position here is slightly in white's favor. There's a main line here where black regains the pawn, but at the end of the day, so you can see, here's how he regains it. White has a better pawn structure, his king is more active, and also has fewer pawn islands. Well, that's part of having the better pawn structure, but it's not just that, but that black's pawns are somewhat vulnerable too, not just that they're in more islands. So white's better here, and this is a bit of analysis from Rogozenko. So if you're a Sveshnikov player, it's a book you probably need to have, although it's getting a little bit long in the tooth now. It's a 2005 book, but still, it's an excellent resource. Okay, so after, again, this premature bishop takes f6, gf6, knight a3, b5 transposes to the main lines, d5 is sharp but probably not best, but f5 might even give black good chances for an advantage, and I'll note one reason why this might be the case. So takes, knight c4, and now, okay, knight to d4, knight to d4, knight e3, bishop e6 is equal, no problems for black here. But bishop to e6 might be even a little bit better, might. So knight e3, bishop h6, and now if white drops the c knight in, then black makes this standard exchange, and then plays d5. And if black is playing d5 in a Sveshnikov, you know that it's bad news for white. I mean, white has done everything wrong if this happens. So bishop e2, castles, and then f5, and obviously this is better for black. So black is definitely for choice here. So knight e to d5 is better, keeping d5 under control, at least as long as possible. So castles, g3, f5, bishop g2, king h8, castles, rook c8, king h1, knight c4, f4, bishop g7. And this is all pretty typical of a Sveshnikov, this kind of position. But, well, there is one important difference from a standard kind of Sveshnikov in this position, and it's in black's favor. So those of you who are Sveshnikovites, see if you can figure out what it is. And for that matter, if you play against a Sveshnikov with white, try to figure out what it is. Well, the big difference is that black's pawn is back on b7. It's not on b5. And the reason why that matters is that white has no natural route for counterplay with a4. So if the pawn were on b5, then white plays a4 and he gets the open a file, and black's queenside pawns are a little bit weak, and that's an advantage. Remember from the earlier question, it's not doesn't mean that white has the advantage in that case, but it's an advantage for white. But here it's completely absent. So black is doing fine here. I don't know if he's better, but certainly no real problems. And this occurred in a game between Sprague and Schulman, and again, this is a variation I dug up out of the Rogozenko book. Okay, so that is what I want to say about this particular question about the Sveshnikov Sicilian. Okay, on to, let me flip the board here. On to Jay Wiz's question. So he asks, can I explain the ideas behind the Lopez knight move? Well, I guess it's really a series of knight moves, not just one. I have seen this knight b to d2, f1, g3 maneuver many times, but I don't really understand the strategic concept behind it, other than assisting in a kingside attack. Well, okay, to some extent, again, you've kind of answered your own question. So, yeah, that's the point behind it. But another point is that, well, okay, there are three things I want to say. So one is, yes, a main point of bringing the knight to g3 in a typical mainline Rui is just that. It's to support a kingside attack in some cases, also to protect the pawn in e4, but you know the knight on g3 may jump into f5 in some cases. Second thing I would say is that the knight basically goes where it can go. So let's take a look here at the basic mainline starting position for the Ruy Lopez. Alright, and we'll make a couple moves here. So knight a5, we'll look at a Chigorin. Bishop c2, c5, d4, and okay, black does not play c takes d4 here. Well, okay, black does sometimes, but I mean it's definitely a minority move. I mean, queen c7 is the overwhelmingly most common move. Knight to d7 is also a very standard move. Sometimes c takes d4 happens, and the idea is to make a bunch of quick trades and play for d5. But generally speaking, black doesn't do that. One reason is that this knight could go to c3 conceivably after such an exchange. So black generally waits until this knight comes out to d2, and only then makes the swap. Okay, well, the knight goes to d2. What's it going to do from there? It's blocking the bishop on c1. If it goes to b3, okay, that doesn't really do a whole heck of a lot. There are some lines where it goes there, but generally it's a very specific, has a very specific function there. It usually ends up getting kicked back to d2. So on d2 it's doing nothing. So it goes to f1. But now from f1, it doesn't always go to g3. Sometimes it goes to e3. And the idea of going to e3 as opposed to g3 is that sometimes the knight will then go to d5. It could go to f5 too, and that does sometimes happen. And also, in some cases, it will go to g4, perhaps with knight f3 to h2 first, and then one or the other knight goes to g4, and occasionally both. Also from f1, okay, let me get rid of all of this. Once the knight is on f1, in addition to going to e3 and g3, sometimes it goes to h2, and again, there can be ideas of bringing the knight to g4, although it's at least as common for the knight from 3 to go to h2. So there are a variety of things that this knight can do. It's not always bouncing over to g3. Okay, so I wanted to say three things, right? So first was, yeah, the knight goes to g3. For general kingside play, sometimes it goes to f5, sometimes it's just getting out of the way and shoring up the e4 pawn. But the knight doesn't always go to g3. It can go to e3, h2, occasionally to b3. And even still more occasionally, it'll even jump into e5. And let me think. I think that might have been all that I'd wanted to say about that in terms of general points. So now let me show you some different particulars. And most of these come from Fisher's games, especially from the book Fisher's My 60 Memorable Games. And this is going to tie into the last question, which we'll get to, of course, after this. Okay, so from here, Fischer-Stein from the Seuss Interzonal in 67 continued like this. So d4, knight a5. This was before the Zaitse was really discovered, where black plays rook to e8. So this is kind of a strange hybrid variation. It's kind of like a Chigorin, but not altogether. Anyway, we have the following. So b3, knight b6, knight b to d2. Here, b4, takes, a5, takes, c5, and now that the e5 pawn is unblockaded, white played e5, and then knight came to e4. And white has a very powerful kingside attack brewing, and it was a great game that Fischer went on to win. Really incredibly complicated game with one of the very best players in the world at the time. Okay, so here we see the knight going to e4. Alright, now let's continue with the Chigorin. So knight a5, bishop c2, c5, d4, and now we'll look at the knight to d7 line. So it's not as common as queen c7, but it's a major line that Paul Keres developed in the early 60s. Okay, now the main move here is knight b to d2, and I'll quickly show you a variation with this. So cd, cd. So again, the knight's on d2, so now black makes the swap. Knight c6. And here, knight to b3 and knight to f1 have both been played. Okay, so if knight f1, takes, knight here, queen d1, bishop f6, knight e3. So here we see the knight going to e3, eyeing the d5 square clearly, but if black were to play bishop to b7, then knight to f5 could happen. Okay, if instead of knight f1, another line is knight to b3. So overprotecting the d pawn, and typically against this kind of move, black will play a5 and a4. And then here, white usually plays knight b to d2, but also sometimes plays knight to c1, which looks kind of funny. But the knight has different tracks from this position. So it could go to e2 and g3. It could go to d3 in some cases. More possibilities become available here. Okay, so that is after knight to d7, knight b to d2. Okay, on d takes c5, this was Fischer's preferred way to play the position. d c5, knight b to d2. And here, there are various possibilities. So, okay, Keres played queen c7 in a game they played in the candidates tournament in Curacao in 1962. And that went knight to f1, knight e3, and now Fischer played knight to d5. I should say something about this structure. So where white makes the swap on c5 or e5 and black makes the corresponding recapture. So here white is hoping that with pawns on e4 and c3, as opposed to black's pawns on c5 and e5, that he'll get the e5 square, while black won't get the d4 square on account of the c3 pawn. So given this kind of structure, it makes sense for white to steer his knight towards d5 if it's possible to go there. And that's in fact what he did with knight to d5. Not really a pawn sack, because if black takes twice on d5, then the e5 pawn goes, plus he's opening up these lines for his bishops. Well, for the bishop on c2. The bishop on c1's already got a nice open diagonal. Okay, so that was on queen c7. The main move, I think, is bishop to b7, then knight f1, knight c4, knight to g3. So here we see it goes to g3. One reason is that if he plays b3 with the idea of playing the knight to e3, well, among other things, black has the possibility of playing b4, and then all of a sudden the d4 square is weakened. So that becomes a potential factor. Alright, so white doesn't want to rush to play b3, so even though the knight's not as good on g3, or at least one of its most enticing options on g3, one of the most enticing options with the knight on e3 is lacking on g3, there are drawbacks to the move. Okay, and then another move that's sometimes played here, and that Fischer faced, is f6. And here too, white has choices. So sometimes white plays knight f1, and then the knight goes to e3. In a game, Fischer-Evkov from Havana in 1965, or at least the Havana tournament in 65, Fischer was in New York at the time, playing by telex. He played knight h4, knight f5, queen g4, and then h4 would have been in his favor. So, yeah, here, I forget what he played. I think he just played knight takes e7 check, taking the bishop here. But should have played queen g4, threatening knight h6 check, and knight takes f7, which he can do because it would counterattack on black's queen. And after king h8, h4, the idea is to play h5, followed by knight f3 and knight h4. So still another idea for this knight on d2. So it didn't even go to f1 this time, but could go to f3, h4, and from there maybe to g6. Okay, so that is it for d4, knight to d7. So let's see queen c7. Well, knight b to d2, and again, black has lots of choices. Alright, in the current main line, in the Chagorn, it goes like this. C takes d4, cd, knight c6, and now if knight f1, black will take twice on d4 because the bishop on c2 hangs. Now that's not the end of the world. White can in fact regain the pawn, but it's an inconvenience, and black is thought to be doing quite well there. So knight to b3 is considered best. Okay, again, a5, preparing to kick the knight back. Bishop e3, taking care of the d4 pawn. a4, knight to d2. Bishop d7, rook c1, queen b7. And now white can choose between queen e2 and knight f1. And knight f1, you can see the knight's going to go on its typical journey. Alright. On knight b to d2, though, there's still more possibilities. So, for instance, bishop to d7, knight f1, rook fe8, knight e3, g6, and once again, white goes for this rouser structure. And here we see this knight to g4 idea. Okay, that was the knight from f3, but the second knight's going to go there as well. Or can go there as well. So after knight takes g4, we reach a position that Fischer had at least 3 times in his career. The first time he got it was against Matanovic from the Porta-Rose Interzonal in 1958, and there he played knight takes g4. So here we see a knight on g4. Matanovic swapped it off and played c4, and the idea is to then reroute this knight, b7, c5, d3. Typical idea. So white, for his part, went for play over on the king side, and I believe this game ended in a draw. Let me see if I can quickly tell. Yeah, pretty sure it did. Okay, so this the point of f6, by the way, is against g5 for one thing. All right. Also, well, even more serious. Rook takes h7, king takes h7, queen f7. Then the bishop moves, and then the rook comes to h1. So f6, yeah, it's forced defense against that, or at least directed against that. Okay. Anyway, the next 2 times Fischer faced this position, he played h takes g4, which he considers better. So this time the knight doesn't move from e3 yet. But, okay, on knight c4, if black were to play this, white could play knight to d5. This is Fischer's recommendation. And he thinks white's slightly better here. Or, if queen c6, which is what he faced, then g5. And now the knight does go to g4 after all. And this occurred in 2 games that Fischer covers in the book My 60 Memorable Games. One is against Ruben Chakran from Mar del Plata in 1959. And the other one is against Unziker in Zurich in 1959. Fischer won both games in nice style. Okay, so that's knight b to d2, bishop to d7. There's also knight to c6. And Fischer has faced this one as well. Now, here a couple of different plans. White sometimes keeps the center closed with d5. And then one idea for white is to try to play like this. g4, knight f1, knight g3, clear, let's say, the g file, and then go for knight f5. So kind of a classic kingside pileup. And so black has to play accurately against this. And this kind of bizarre-looking setup from black is actually quite effective. It was discovered by Rubinstein many, many years ago. So he does this with both of his knights, and it proves quite difficult for white to break in. So white's dreaming of playing knight to f5 someday, but it's very difficult to achieve that in a meaningful way, in a way where it'll work. Okay, so that's on knight c6 and white closing the center with d5. You can also play d takes c5, dc, and now again we'll see various knight possibilities. Rook d8, queen e2, knight h5, threatening to jump into f4, g3, g6, h4, and knight e3. So again, when you've got this Rouser plan, knight e3 is much more common. And then knight to d5. But wait, we'll see more permutations and peregrinations of the knight. So knight h2, and then knight to g4. And here if rook to f8, well, we can do it again with the second knight. Knight e3 followed by knight to d5. So in the game Fischer-Bisgeier, Bisgeier chose to capture on g4. And white's better thanks to his bishop here. His bishop here is meaningful enough that he has the advantage in this position. And of course, because it was Fischer-Bisgeier, Fischer went on to win. Bisgeier was a very strong grandmaster, but had just a dreadful record against Fischer. He beat him the first time they played when Fischer was quite young. The second game they played was a draw, and then Fischer went, I think, 13 or 14-0 against him the rest of their careers. So, okay, well that's all I wanted to say about this knight maneuver. So you can see the fact the knight goes to g3 quite regularly doesn't mean it always goes to g3. There are quite a lot of ways in which this knight can find meaningful employment, and it depends quite often on what both sides do with the central pawn tension. So hope that helps. Okay, finally, a question that doesn't ask about a particular position, but I think it's a very good one, from Emstrom, and he asks the following. Okay, so he refers to, I think, a position from a game of Botvinnik's that I mentioned on my blog. Speaking of which, I should mention, my blog has now moved. So change your bookmarks and visit thechessmind.net. Thechessmind.net. And see all kinds of interesting stuff. So that's the new address. Anyway, from the previous address, he saw a game there, and he refers to it. Anyway, about this, he's asking, so it's a Botvinnik game, and I said that Botvinnik gives such and such in his notes, claiming initiative for white. So he asks, I was wondering where somebody obtains these notes other than buying books on the player and hoping they have been published with the games. You are constantly referencing players' notes in your videos, as do other chess video makers and authors. I'm not a great chess player by any means, but I love the history of the game and I've always wondered how people obtained these notes. I understand how current players would not divulge this information, but for retired or deceased GMs, people are always quoting their notes. Perhaps the only way is to pore over volumes of books, but I've always been curious just the same. Well, it's not really a mystery. You just buy books, as you kind of suggested. So what kind of books should you get? Well, I've often recommended, and I'll by all means take the opportunity to do so again, buy books about great players by great players. So, the best thing you can do most of the time when you're looking for game collections is to, find a book by a world champion about his own career. So most of them have done it, maybe all of them. But certainly going back to Olyekin, there's a great tradition. So Olyekin has written some excellent books on his own career, and if you're willing to get the descriptive ones, and the ones in descriptive notation, you'll get it extremely cheaply. Botvinnik has written many autobiographical books and they're great. Smyslov has some autobiographical volumes. Tal has his Life and Games book. Actually, the Tal book is probably the best written, but perhaps the least deeply annotated. But it's a great book. Petrosian has written comparatively little on his own career, but and same for Spassky. But Fischer with his 60 Memorable Games. Karpov has some good autobiographical books. Kasparov has some old books, and again now, his books on the matches with Karpov are very good. Anand has a nice collection. Kramnik does. Shirov with the two Fire on Board books, and so on. Anyway, it's not difficult at all, but I would say, buy these books by the players themselves. What else? ChessBase's databases, their mega database. There you can find a lot of very good notes, sometimes by the original artists, so to speak, in their collection of old games as well as contemporary games. But really, that'd be my recommendation. Also, not a world champion, but Korchnoi has some great books on his own career. But generally speaking, that's what I would recommend. And now to kind of tie it in to what I was a couple of other questions that we already looked at. So you'll notice that in this Knight F1 in the Rui question, I was able to introduce many very good examples from Fischer's own play, and they were incredibly instructive. So you don't need to buy a book necessarily on the Ruy Lopez to get an answer to this. You can kind of derive it by looking at great examples, and what better example than that of a world champion. Also, I think this is going to tie into the question about the Sveshnikov earlier. So, the Sveshnikov is an incredibly complicated opening, and, no reason not to play it. But, unless you're playing really strong players, titled players on a regular basis, it's absolutely insane to spend large chunks of your life keeping up with, the latest novelty on Move 25 and the Sveshnikov. It's ridiculous. So, if you play it and you've learned it over the course of years, and you understand what you're doing, and you've developed it to the point where you understand what things are happening well enough that you can intelligently keep up with the novelties, then great. But to just try to master these things and just to master the particular move orders without really developing as a player is nuts. So what should you do? Well, you should always work on your tactics, of course, but I think one of the best ways to learn openings is to not study openings per se, but to look at games played by great players. If you just go through my 60 Memorable Games and you see how Fischer handles the Ruy Lopez, you're going to get a great understanding of many kinds of closed Ruy Lopez structures. Okay, now you won't learn every kind, but you'll learn a lot, and especially about this rouser structure, you'll learn a great deal. Now, you'll take some lumps when you play a really strong player who knows where the theory has gone since Fischer's day, and the theory in a broad sense, not just this or that particular move, but some of the ideas that have been developed since the late 60s when Fischer finished the book. But still, what you'll learn from going over games by great players is tremendous. You'll see what a real game looks like, where pieces are supposed to go, what good plans look like. And that, I think, is much more valuable and will make a much stronger impression than buying the latest 300-page tome on Variation X and trying somehow to slog through it and praying that enough of it sticks that you can remember what to do when you play this at the club. So, buy books by the players themselves on their own careers. So if you say you like chess history, if you're a lover of chess history, then that's what you do. So you don't buy some random player's book on them. You buy the book by them themselves. So the higher up you go in the food chain, for autobiographical books especially, the better. Okay, well that'll do it. We went quite a long ways, but I hope that there was at least something for everyone to enjoy and to benefit from. So thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.